Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about my Leaguestarter for 3.23, which is going to be a Poison Caustic Arrow Ballista Pathfinder. So 1.5 years ago, I played a Caustic Arrow Poison Leaguestarter. Back then it was a Trickster. I basically just wanted to play something else after Explosive Arrow, but I was still on that Ballista high, and it delivered. It was really fun to play, and it gave me one of my smoothest feared kills I've ever had. But there were a few issues. For example, it was a little bit too squishy, and my recovery was only on kill, so it kind of felt bad in boss fights. So I didn't really update the guide. Basically told people it's a fine build, but it's nothing to write home about. I wouldn't put it into my top league starters or something like that. And then something interesting happened. GGG released a Transfigure gem of Caustic Arrow that loses the dot pool, which was already completely useless for the poison version, and gave it a ton of stats that make the poison version even stronger. As well as that, another weakness of the build was that you had to go Darkscorn, which could be expensive on day one, but they just released a tincture that lets elemental damage poison as well. So you can now just follow what every lightning arrow build is doing and just stack flat elemental damage on your build. And with this amount of flat damage, you also alleviate one of the weaknesses of poison attack builds, which is its over-reliance on Covenant. Which, don't get me wrong, Covenant's still good, but it doesn't double or even triple your damage anymore because you now can actually craft a good bow. So yeah, with that said, I just want to point out that this is not completely tested. We basically did a leveling run yesterday, and it went just as smooth as I remembered. You do not have to go Toxic Rain. You can actually swap at level 38. But for this video, I also made an endgame version, and if we're talking end game, I will also do updates on Leaguestarter. But if you're a new player or you're somebody who needs everything step by step digested for them, then this will not be the build guide for you. I don't have the time anymore to do that. So you can also check out my top 7 starter list. Maybe something's there that's more interesting to you. But all right, let's go into the build. So I just finished a testing run right here. I'm going to quickly show you how Caustic Arrow works and why Poison is so strong with it. So what you guys probably know when it comes to Caustic Arrow, or a lot of you guys, is this dot pool right here, which can deal a lot of damage. It's usually something you either play with Death's Oath or that you support Toxic Rain with. However, what you don't see, what's under this dot pool, is an actual impact, an actual hit with an AoE. And that hit can not only poison, but it also shotguns or overlaps multiple projectiles, and this gets pretty damn easy up to 7. After that, you will have to stack some extra AoE, but just to show you how clustered together these hits actually are if you go greater volley. And that is also why they have the base damage so low, which is very deceiving, because this up to 64% or 70% on the new gem can actually be multiplied and overlapped up to 7 times. So if we're talking about the Transfigure gem, we're going to talk about 70 times 7, so we have a very high damage effectiveness. And obviously we have opportunity costs like having to run greater volley or having to get additional projectiles on the passive tree, but that's kind of the same for every bow build. But to make this clear again, you only care about the hit and not about the dot pool. The dot pool is completely useless. So this thing right here, these overlapping dot pools that come after the hit, basically deal no damage compared to all the poisons that we're stacking, and they can't poison themselves. So that is why it has completely different scaling. The scaling is a lot more similar to what a normal bow build would do. In this case, scale a lot of physical and chaos damage. For example, a leveling bow would look something like this thicket bow right here, where you have a little bit of flat fizz, maybe crafted physical damage if you have the alterations for it, and then attack speed if you're lucky. So what that means is stuff like Krill Rain or +2 levels on your bow is completely useless. This is not a Toxic Rain build. It scales completely different. You just have to look at how little physical damage this actually has. You will completely gimp your build if you use something like Krill Rain. +2 levels does barely anything as well. And now let's look at the biggest reason why I'm going to play this build is because at some point we have the expectation of being able to get a Caustic Arrow of Poison. This completely removes that dot pool, making it also way more obvious for people what we're actually scaling, which makes absolutely no difference. We're talking like 0.9% less damage in total, but we're getting a ton of flat added chaos damage, which was always a problem with this build, because if you have no inbuilt base damage, then you need a good weapon. And on Leaguestarter, you don't have the money to spend to get something crazy, so that's very strong. The Fizz converted to chaos, completely whatever, doesn't do anything, because both physical and chaos can poison, so doesn't do anything there. The +2 meters, this is actually from 0.6 to 0.8, but that's only because the quality got changed. That's the same on the normal one. And then we have also 40% chance to poison, which on a very tight passive tree already frees up a lot of points. It also makes it so we don't have to use Herald of Agony, which is very, very nice. And Something that you might have missed as well when you saw this gem is the attack damage and effectiveness of added damage, which is actually 70 here, which on the normal gem at a level 20 is like 64%. So that's another 9% more damage. But here's the thing. The reason why I wanted to test it right now, especially while leveling, is because I'm not expecting to get this early. I know that some people think you're probably just going to go into lab and you're going to get it after first lab. They even said so, kind of, but that might just be completely random. We don't know if you can actually target them. So I wanted to make sure that even if this is like, I don't know, cost a divine or like 100 chaos, or we have to farm it ourselves in like merciless lab or maybe even uber lab, the build is still fine, and it is. So while this is a crazy upgrade to look forward to, it is not necessary to play the build. Otherwise, I would not recommend this as a League starter. Now, another thing that this build does well is an easy transition to Tornado Shot endgame, whether that's you want to respec into a Deadeye, or you want to just go non-Ballista Poison Tornado Shot. There are a lot of reasons why you would want to go only Ballistas early. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I'm just saying that just because you're playing this build, you're not locked into anything. You also Pathfinder, one of the strongest Ascendancies right now, which can divert into basically any build you want without having to re-level. Now, where do we get our poison chance from? On the normal Caustic arrow, to get 100% poison chance, we need 20% from Herald of Agony and then 80% from the passive tree. That is 15% from here, 10% from there, 15% from Toxic Strikes, and then 15 and 10 from these small points, and then another 20 from these small points. And then once you have the Caustic Arrow of Poison, this one has intrinsically 40% chance to poison, so we don't need the Herald of Agony anymore, which frees up Reservation, and as well as that, we only have to get 60% from the passive tree. So the ones we already talked about, minus these 2 points that you can cut now. Then let's discuss why Ballistas. This is a thing that some people love, some people hate. It's something that you should just try out for yourself, whether you like it or not. But there is a few reasons why focusing solely on Ballistas can be very strong, especially in League Start. Most of these upside way down the faster and the more geared you get. So this is only a League Start discussion. The first reason is that you have way more damage uptime than if you were self-cast. If you think about it, a boss can hit usually pretty hard. So you place down your totems and now you can just run around, frenzy, debilitate them, curse them while your totems do their thing. And they will not stop firing until they die. Meanwhile, if you were self-cast, you have to stand there and target, and whenever an enemy does anything, you have to kite around. So while maybe on a self-cast build, you would only 30 to 40% of the time get your shots in, and otherwise you have to move and get out of mechanics, on this build, I would say it's more like 80 to 90% of the time. They're still a little bit subtracted because sometimes enemies move out of the range of Ballistas or they die. And this is something that anybody who ever played this kind of build can attest to, but it's still worth noting. As well as that, the damage is also increased because you have perfect aiming, especially when it comes to skills that you have to overlap, like for example, Caustic Arrow right here, and you have to do it right down the middle. You would have to name lock the enemy while kiting all the time to get the perfect amount of shotgun. Totems do this naturally. As well as that, you don't have to aim yourself at all. Sure, you have the Mirage Archer above your back, but that is like a minuscule amount of your damage. With totems, your wrists are safe. Talking about safe though, your playstyle is also a lot more safe because you can just place down the totems and do whatever you want. You can stand around wherever you want, and they are ranged totems, so you don't have to stand next to the enemy and place them down next to them and then move away. You can literally just put them wherever you want. We're not point blank. We're not far shot. It doesn't matter. They will hit. They are ranged, and they have a lot of range in general. And another reason why people nowadays opt into only going Ballistas is Wilma's Requital. This one gives you a little bit of LA damage with attacks, accuracy rating, and Ancestral Bond, which basically gives you +1 totem, but you don't deal any damage yourself. However, that's the first payoff, but the second one is increases the reductions to cast speed also applied to attack speed, which means that stuff like Onslaught, Adrenaline, Haste, Val Haste will actually double dip, so it will not just give you the attack speed portion, it will also give you the cast speed portion. And sure, while late game, this pales in comparison to self-cast setups once you get your crazy bows. This is a very welcome mid-game power boost. Also, until you have Wilma's Requital, there's no reason why you could do damage yourself as well. You will have 2 setups. We're going to talk about that as well. However, once you have this, Ancestral Bond makes it so you yourself don't deal any damage anymore. Now, another important thing to talk about is what happened this league with Tinctures. So if you guys don't know, there's a new Ascendancy tree. One of them enables you to put Tinctures on your bows. So basically, you can apply whatever is on this Tincture to that weapon, and you can make it so all the damage on your bow can poison. You still need 100% chance to poison. It just says can. It doesn't say it does. But what that means is you can now go from some of these very annoying to make bows or getting like a dark scorn to in endgame something like this, which is way easier to craft than having to do the same thing with a chaos damage roll and a physical roll. And even if you can do that, it's still nowhere near the amount of damage and the amount of flat damage that you would get here. And that also means that we're not as reliant on Covenant anymore. Obviously, I didn't put Covenant into this POB. It's still there. It's still good. As you can see, it gives you like, actually you can't see, it still gives you like 50% more damage, but it isn't necessary anymore to get your flat damage up. And I know this is a new item, so we don't know how rare it's going to be, but it's not a modifier in this item. It's not like you need to hunt for these. This is just the base type that you just get from the vendor. It doesn't matter what's on this tincture. This all damage can poison is an implicit that will always stay there. So that's why I will also plan around it. I do have a bow in my POB just in case for some reason you need one. You just want a chaos damage roll, a little bit of fizz if you can, and then craft on attack speed. Or get a Dark Scorn, but Dark Scorn is usually way too expensive on day one. Now then let's talk about one of our biggest boons in terms of being a Pathfinder and going for defenses, which is Petrified Blood. This reserves 35% of your mana, but it gives you an effect where whenever you get hit, a portion of that hit is stored and dealt to you over time. Sort of like one of the most OP flasks in the game, which is Progenesis. And what this does is basically, if you have a lot of regen, now that damage will basically be non-existent because your regen just goes against it instead of you getting one shot. And if you look at my effective hit pool, you can very clearly see that it does quite a bit of work in that regard. But obviously such an OP effect has to have a downside, right? Well, it sets you to half-life and you cannot regen or leech over that cap. So you're basically capped at half-life, which is not very good. However, with Pathfinder and the Master Surgeon Ascendancy, you can actually go above because it doesn't say anything about flasks. So you might have noticed a little bit of a nice life recovery here. This is not leech or anything. This is just passive. 1,775 HP, which kind of reminds people of RF builds. This is because of that. So what Master Surgeon does is it halves your life recovery from flasks, but normally life flasks stop at full life, not with this one. So it basically turns your reactive life flask, usually you have to press it whenever you take damage, you have to react to it, into a sort of regeneration aura that is always up as long as you press it every 6 to 7 seconds. And this amount of regen will basically completely neglect any damage over time you stand on or that you get dealt to, including the Petrified Blood that we just talked about. So yes, I understand that some people are confused that I don't go Nature's Boon or I don't just go this. Until you have Progenesis, Taste of Hate, all those endgame items, this is an incredibly easy fix for your defenses. And don't get me wrong, it's not like we're tanky, right? Even with guard skill up, we're not exactly super tanky. But this just gets your build to a point where a build like this that would usually be super squishy is a lot more comfortable to play, especially since totem builds usually have a huge problem with regen because they do not leech for you, and that is also solved in one go. But on that topic, let's talk about the Ascendancy Choice. So the first thing I want to talk about is the new Ascendancy before we get to Pathfinder, which is going to be the Warden of the Magi. So there's where the tinctures that we already talked about comes from. Can apply tinctures to your equipped weapons. If you don't have this Ascendancy, you cannot do that. So all of your damage will poison, even your elemental damage. And on top of that, we get Nature's Concoction, which basically, if you have hit recently, which you do with your Frenzy, right? Your totems don't count, but you still hit. You get 3 charges whenever you hit an enemy. And on top of that, you get increased effect to flasks that are next to your tincture. So the tincture will be right here. It replaces a flask slot, and it will be next to the Jade Flask. As you can see right here, tincture, 30% increased effect, and it will also increase your Quicksilver Flask. However, in this mid-game setup, we have another node, which is the first node you should take. Oath of the Magi. Oh boy, this is such a huge quality of life node for basically every build on Leaguestarter, but especially for a build like this that isn't very gem heavy. As you can see in my gem, I have 8 sockets open, and that is because of this node right here. 50% to all res if you have an equipped helmet, but you have no socketed gems. You can still have the sockets, whatever. You just don't socket anything in. You get 50% all res. Now, with a Pathfinder and a 100% uptime on a Bismuth Flask of the Rainbow, you cap your resistance without having anywhere. We have no res anywhere on the gear. That is ridiculous. Then you get 25% increased maximum life if you have gloves with no sockets, which we're going to use later to make it easier to path on our passive tree. However, early, very, very strong is going to be the movement speed if you have equipped boots with no socketed gems. This gives you your first speed bump because you are a bow build. You don't have shield charge or leap slam to move around, so that is very strong. And also late game, you can replace the 50% all res. Once you have gear with resistances, you can replace those with whatever you want. At the end, we're probably going to choose at least one of those bonuses. In mid-game, probably even two. Now, end-game, you can think about going here and getting some charms, but the problem is then you lose the tinctures, and then you would have to go Dark Scorn again, or buy like a Mirror Tier Fizzbow to even have a chance to compete with what these tinctures do. You also lose the flask effect. So personally, not recommended. Then let's talk about Ascendancies. Last time I played this, I played a Trickster, but that was mostly because I didn't really have any choice. Pathfinder back then wasn't very good for this build. Now it is. So Pathfinder gives us Wither, which is probably the biggest thing. Wither more than doubles your damage, and with a fast-hitting skill like Caustic Arrow, you actually have it on 15 all the time. We do so many hits that we actually apply 20 plus per second, and it lasts for 2 seconds. So even against rares while mapping, you will feel this damage increase quite a lot. The second note here is Master Toxicist, which gives you 20% more damage, basically, and then also makes it so that your poisons prolife, which is very strong, as a lot of Ignite players know. Obviously, it's not as strong as Ignite Prolif because it also prolifs only one poison, but it still overlaps if there is a huge pack. And on top of that, this paired with the Azenav's Gentle Touch gloves will give you a ton of extra clear. And we then have Nature's Adrenaline, which makes it possible that you can actually have a Bismuth Flask always up. It's really important that you have this on 100% flask uptime always, because if it's not on, you're on 0 res and you're going to get clapped. So this has to be on 100% uptime, and that is quite annoying to do on other Ascendancies. And otherwise, you would have to gear an extra 240 res on your gear. So that's quite strong. In endgame, once again, this can be done. We're talking about early to mid game, where I want to make this build as comfortable as possible. And then Master Surgeon, we already talked about this. This fixes your regen and also makes it so your max hit goes a little bit up for Ranger, so we can use Petrified Blood. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't play this on somewhere else. I would even say that Champion is quite competitive with Pathfinder if it gets Wither from something like a Balance of Terra. You have a Balance of Terra with a Despair mod that gives you Wither on hit. You can go Champion, but that can cost up to like 10 Divines on League Start. So if you're starting later and you maybe have somebody who gives it to you, this can get a lot tankier than even the Pathfinder. However, that's not completely true, because if you go very expensive on Pathfinder, you can go like Progenesis, Taste of Hate. So I'm not 100% sure about the endgame implications of those two versus each other, but Champion can feel good as well. The damage without Wither, though, will be astronomically lower. You will basically be forced early to go for something like Withering Touch, so you're basically on a 5 or even a 4 link. Now, next up, let's talk about items. First thing, we have the bow. What I have right here is a Tincture applied, all damage from hits can poison, and then I spammed a Deafening Essence until I hit T3 or better. In this case, I just hit T3 cold, nothing else, and then just craft on attack speed. And this is the absolute bare bones bow. In a more endgame setup, you would want something like this. So that would be, once again, Deafening Essence, but you would have one of the flat damage, so either fire or cold fractured. It also doesn't matter which essence you applied. It really doesn't matter. It just matters that you have all three. And this is a tier 2 and a tier 3 that you hit, which is quite possible on a reasonable budget. And then if you, for example, craft the suffixes to get a veiled mod with attack speed, you can also craft on chaos damage over time multiplier. Obviously, this can get even better, just like, for example, in lightning arrow bows that can go up to hundreds of divines, maybe a mirror tier. But this is a okay bow to put into this PoB, kind of something to strive for. And before you have a tincture, I also put this bow in here. What you're looking for is physical damage and chaos damage, because those can poison. Once again, you don't want +2 levels. Those all do not matter. So early, if you don't have that tincture, elemental damage will not do anything for your poison. So just in case those are like hard to get, I can also put, I guess, a Dark Scorn in here if you really want to. Just make sure that you get a little bit of chaos res, because otherwise you will actually take a lot of physical as chaos, which can be an upside. But if you have no chaos res, it's actually a downside. However, in a perfect scenario, you never want to even have to get a Dark Scorn, because those LE bows exist and they are a lot better. When it comes to Quiver, your most important mod is damage over time multiplier with attack skills. Whether that is the normal one or the chaos one from a hunter base, doesn't really matter. You want a little bit of life. Damage with bow skills is very strong. That also counts for your poison, because it comes from your bow skill. And then craft on attack speed or you have attack speed, that is the least important of the mods. You can also fix something like Chaos Res if you want to. In terms of implicits, totem placement speed is nice to have. However, an artillery quiver base is not that easy to get, so you can also go for something like attack speed. And before you get this item, there's no reason to not do a little bit of damage yourself if you have the gem sockets for it. So you can also make your own Caustic Arrow setup. As for this body armor, you just want to buy a cheap 6-link. It should definitely be evasion based as much as you can. That's good. If you can get some Eldritch Implicits on it, even better. These are all lowest tier Eldritch Implicits, and they're also very easily replaceable. Just go for anything that gives you something. Then life, evasion, and if you only have evasion and no life mod, you can actually also go for this life mastery right here. I didn't put it in because it's confusing for people. Sometimes they forget to put it out. So, but just so you know, this exists as well if you don't have that life roll on there. You can also just buy a corrupted 6-link. That's what I'm most likely going to do early. As for mods, the physical damage taken as elemental will help out a lot early game to reduce some of that weakness that the right side builds usually have. You also don't have a helmet where you can get it, so the more the merrier. Later, if you have a Taste of Hate, that's even better. Azenov's Gentle Touch, usually on Leaguestarter, is around about 60 to 70 chaos. If you want to get it very early, maybe even 100, and then it kind of dips down to like 30, 40. There's also a divination card for it. So in general, not that hard to get. Amulet that maybe looks something like this. You have damage over time multiplier, some life. Accuracy you can get anywhere. I just put it on here. Then maybe a prefix open for a little bit of flat damage. You can go for something like Coordination, which only costs you 1 black oil and the crimson oil. And it gives you a ton of attack speed because the cast speed also gets converted to attack speed once you have Wilmas. And if you don't have Wilmas either, you can go for something like Corruption, which gives you a ton of damage, but it will, however, cost you 2 black oils. As for boots, all that really matters is movement speed and a little bit of spell suppress. Now, you don't need the spell suppress until you get your tincture because you can actually get a quartz flask, but after that, you will have to cut it and get the spell suppress somewhere else to be capped. If you're not capped, you can also throw in some lucky spell suppress if you want, but even if you're running around with 90%, it's not the end of the world. And you want action speed, which doesn't work for your totems in terms of how fast you attack. It still gives you better placement speed and movement speed. But if you get movement speed instead of action speed, that's also totally fine. Don't waste your money. That's about it for the boots. Boots and helmets don't have enchants anymore, just in case you weren't aware. As for rings, whether you get your int and your strength here or on the amulet and you get the accuracy here, it doesn't matter, vice versa. What you want is a life roll. If you can, an amethyst base, it's very strong. As well as that, a coral ring can help out because your resistance is already taken care of. Also very strong. And then what you want on here is either added lightning damage, or if you don't have the tincture yet, you want added chaos damage. And after that, the belt is a very important slot. You want flash charges gained, flask effect duration, and as well as that, you can also get, as a third mod if you're super lucky, or instead of any of these mods, also reduced flash charges used. These are all very strong ways to get your Bismuth Flask to 100% flask uptime. And once you have that, you need to enchant it with used when charges reach full, so you actually automate it. Otherwise, if you forget to press it, you're dead. Speaking about that flask, this basically negates any problems you have on your gear early. Later, once again, Progenesis, Taste of Hate, stuff like that. You can think about removing it, but only if you actually fix your problems on the rest of your gear. As you can see here, I have quite a lot of suffixes open, so you will have to look at that yourself. I will obviously make updates at Leaguestarter. A Jade Flask with Evasion rating during effect. This gets 30% increased effect from the Tincture because you place the Tincture in between the Jade and the Quicksilver Flask, and that's from the note right here. The Jade Flask does not have 100% uptime, which is why you use reused at the end of this flask's effect. Basically, what that will do is you won't have it permanently up against bosses. However, in any mapping scenario, there's no way you're ever basically going to run out of it. That's basically what this means. And I know a lot of people want to go for stuff like, I don't know, natural remedies and also go careful conservationist, but it matters so little amounts of time. This matters only once you get your end game flasks. Until then, and while you're mapping, you will not even feel a difference. The second thing that you're going to give the effect on is the Quicksilver Flask with a little bit of increased movement speed during flask effect. Important to note here, in terms of prefixes that I didn't fill right now, whether charge recovery or reduced charges used or anything like that are the best is something that you have to determine for yourself. If you really care about the min-max, you have to probably go into PoB and just see how your flask uptime actually goes. For example, in these cases, I have like 83% average uptime. So sure, you can make that 100% if you really want to. I don't think it's necessary. Now then, the life flask. I already talked about this when I talked about Petrified Blood in the intro, but basically you want as much increased amount recovered as you can, and that is because this is now your basically your regen aura. It's never going to stop because of Pathfinder's Master Surgeon. It's incredibly strong. And the reduced recovery rate is actually good because that means it stretches out over a longer time and you don't have to press your life flask as often. The reason you have such good recovery is actually that you take these nodes on the tree, you have these two small nodes, you have field medicine, and on top of that, these nodes also give you increased life recovery from flasks, and this node gives you increased flask recovery rate. As you can see right here down below, 11,195 life over 7.4 seconds. That results in 1,600 life regen. Next up, let's talk about gems. We are only totems, no self-cast setup because we don't deal damage ourselves because of Wilmas. So we have a lot of sockets open. We could do some neat stuff with that here or there. However, what I opted to do for mid-game to make gearing easier is use Oath of the Magi as much as possible. In this PoB, I have 177 movement speed. That is actually without the 30% movement speed here. So you could go over 200 if you really wanted to. I opted for the 50 all res for easy gearing and then also the 25% max life so you can actually survive and get levels. However, early, especially before you get Onslaught from Sleepless Sentries, which is always up, ensure you get it on kill from Graceful Assault, but that is not the same. Until you get that, you can definitely leave no sockets open in your boots instead and get that 30% movement speed. Just know that you're going to be a little bit squishier. For our main setup, we have Caustic Arrow with Ballista Totem. Pretty standard. Once again, the gem I have added right here in the config. There is no PoB update right now. It gives you extra flat damage. It gives you a chance to poison and a little bit of more damage. Then we have Unbound Ailments. Obviously, in the perfect world, you would want Awakened Unbound Ailments, which is a lot stronger. You have Deadly Ailments, which the hit damage of your Ballistas doesn't matter at all. You have Life Tap, which, sure, if you can figure out your mana endgame, that's nice, but I want to have it as cozy as possible for now. So we're going that. You don't have to think about mana at all. As you can see right here, we have not that much unreserved. A little bit unreserved is still really good for the other skills, though. And obviously, you have Greater Volley. Now, you need Volley because of how this skill actually works. If you look at this, it cannot be as clustered if it spreads out with GMP. And then we have some defensive auras, namely Grace and Petrified Blood. Grace is just incredibly strong, and if you want to know more about Petrified Blood, I talked about it in the intro. Val Haste, we are not using Haste itself, and I didn't tick Val Haste because it's kind of fake DPS, but it will be up during mapping quite a bit, and it will make you faster, and it will also give you a ton of attack speed, so that's very nice. You can use that whenever you want to. And then at the end here, I put Precision, which basically fixes a little bit of your accuracy rating. Now, if you have it on gear anyways, then it doesn't matter. I just wanted to make the gearing as comfortable as possible for this. So that is here. You can replace it with something like Dread Banner, for example. As you can see right here, the evasion goes up a little bit because nearby enemies have less accuracy rating. It's kind of like another blind if you want to. You can even support it with Arrogance to get even more. You can totally do that. Maybe go into like a little bit of a Wind Dancer version. But this is what I have so far, and those are kind of more endgame. Now, one thing to note here is actually you should look at which things you have in your weapon because you get 100 accuracy per green socket on equipped bow. So there is a reason why certain gems are in your bow and certain gems are in your boots, right? You have to actually look at that. All these green gems, we get a total of 500 accuracy from that one node, which is completely ridiculous. We then have all the non-green things in our boots, namely Flame Dash for moving. If you prefer Blink Arrow, go for it. I actually like Flame Dash a little bit more endgame. It's also way better against bosses. Then we have Despair, which you basically just click on really high health enemies. You can also automate this later if you really want to, especially something like an Azimuth with a Despair Corruption. Make sure to note, though, that Despair obviously does a lot more if you self-cast it because it's going to be level 20 with 20 quality instead of a level 1. And then at the end, we have in our boots Steel Skin with increased duration. This is our guard skill. While this is up, we are obviously a lot more tanky. Do note, though, that you can go with a Cast when Image Taken setup, Immortal Call, if you really want to. Do not go Cast when Image Taken with Steel Skin because then you would have to level up cost of damage taken, and it's not going to proc very often. But yeah, I usually just put Steel Skin on left click and be done with it. As for the passive tree, I will put out a leveling video, so if you care about that, that will be in a separate POB, but I will also most likely include it into this. Either way, you'll see it anyways whenever it's up. The start of the pathing is up to you. If you're lacking evasion, you can also path through here, but this is more efficient. It is a quite point heavy tree. You really need watchtowers, which give you +1 totem, and then also +1 from Panopticon, for a total of 6 totems with Wilma's Requital. Also very important is chance to poison. 15% here. In total, 25% from this cluster, 25% from this cluster, and then if you need to, 20% here. However, we don't need it because whenever we have the Transfigure gem, we get 40% innately. Make sure that you're always on 100%. As for masteries, I guess once again important is that you put as many green gems as you can into your equipped bow so that this accuracy can actually do its thing. Other than that, we're scaling a lot of life recovery from flasks for our Master Surgeon, as you can see right here. You definitely want to pick up Entrench for the whole thing here. Life flask and free charges when you suppress spell damage is also quite strong. The last thing you would take is probably the jewels, because you obviously also have to buy them or craft them, whatever. Make sure that you get these +2 arrows right here, Master Fletcher and Multi-Shot. Later you can get a Thread of Hope, which will give you Aspect of the Eagle, Multi-Shot, and Master Fletcher. More on that probably in another video in terms of endgame. Now, you really want this cluster jewel setup. The perfect one is Unholy Grace, Unwaveringly Evil. So these two are in front and you don't have to take the point behind. However, if you have 3 good nodes, that's also totally fine. And then you definitely want this medium cluster jewel because it gives you Sleeping Sentries, which is a little bit of totem duration, which can be nice, but you get Onslaught if you summoned a totem recently. And that is not only on kill, like with Graceful Assault. Now, once you have this node, you still want to keep Graceful Assault because it gives you so much evasion and also increased effect of Onslaught. And on this build, every bit of Onslaught gives you both attack and cast speed, which then double dip with Wilma's Requital. The second node here is less important. You can go for something like attack, cast speed, and placement speed, but Snaring Spirits I think would be GG because it also hinders enemies and it gives you a ton of totem damage. We have a ton of spell suppression from the tree, a total of 90%, and then you either have a Quartz Flask for 100, or later when you don't have space for a Quartz Flask anymore because you need a Tincture here, you're actually going to get it on your boots. Just need 10%, which I think is tier 3. A question I get asked a lot about is Wind Dancer. I personally don't put it into my POBs because people don't care about the gear as much as I sometimes do. So they will be running around with like 70% evade chance, and then they see Wind Dancer and they're going to take it. Just know that if you have anything other than like 85 to 90% evasion, Wind Dancer is not that great. But after that, it actually becomes really damn good. Helps you not get one shot. This 10% movement speed is also only something that really gets fully activated once you have a ton of evasion. Also, make sure you don't forget about this 20% AoE node while having a bow. It helps a lot with overlaps. And before red maps, you definitely want to have the enemies poisoned by you cannot deal critical strikes. It's incredible. It basically makes all of these crit multi and crit things on maps completely useless. And then this you only want once you actually get your Azanov's Gentle Touch, because then your poison duration gets increased by temporal chains, and then you can make that a little bit faster with this mastery. As for leveling, this is a pretty standard setup. We are, however, not going Poisonous Concoction. More on that in the full leveling video. But yeah, I will have a full POB by then. Once I have that video out, I will also link it down in the description here. Now, then a quick thing about progression and uniques. Some items, when you get them, don't get their full value until you also change other stuff about your build, so that's very important. Whenever you get Azanov's Gentle Touch, yes, you get the explosions, but it's just as much as important is the temporal chains on hit that you get. However, your curse limit right now is 1, so what are you supposed to do? You need to get +1 curse from somewhere. The easiest way, quote unquote, or the most efficient way I should say, would be get a Whispers of Doom anoint, but this costs 3 golden oils, and you don't just want to spend 3 golden oils on a shitty amulet. If you have something like this, I think you're good to go, but if you don't, before that, there is 2 more options. The first one is in the boot slots, which is Wind Scream. I know it's armor, and it doesn't really give you any life, but it's still okay, and it gives you an additional curse, and you won't feel that movement speed as much if you actually get the value from the Oath of the Magi. Not really recommended, though. I think the second best option would just get a Dodra's Damning Ring. Also gives you +1 to additional maximum curse. Gives you a little bit of res, a little bit of int. It's not the worst string ever. Another thing that the Asenov's Gentle Touch will do is, with the temp chains, make your poison slower, which is a good thing. It doesn't really make it slower, it just makes it longer. But you can take advantage of that with the Mastery. Now, this Mastery doesn't really give you boss damage. It's just for mapping. It makes your poisons faster, which means you get to your explosions faster and your proliferations faster. You will definitely feel this while clearing. If you only care about bossing, you can leave it out. Another important thing is Wilma's Requital. Once you get Wilma's, you now don't deal damage yourself anymore because of Ancestral Bond, but you can place another totem. You get accuracy from it. Don't forget about that. That is very important, actually, in the gearing process. So that's cool. The energy shield, doesn't really do anything. We have Blood Rage anyways. At this point, you want to have Onslaught, and not just from the Graceful Assault. You want to have it from Sleepless Sentries, so it's also up against bosses. The Onslaught gives you a ton of attack speed because the cast speed also gets converted to attack speed. So you just get a ton. You double dip on it. You don't want to miss out on it, and you want to have it up against bosses where the damage is the most important. Also, once you get this helmet, your build will also feel a lot better, apply Wither faster, all of that good stuff. So definitely get that totem cluster. And now you're kind of in Ballista mode. You can cut your self-attack setup, and the playstyle is going to be a lot more cozy. Make sure you also get a Val Haste at this point. Haste is completely useless because we don't have the reservation for it, but Val Haste is a very, very nice one button that you can press to be faster and deal more damage. And then in terms of Covenant, it's still a really good damage upgrade. Don't get me wrong. It's like 50, I guess you guys saw. It's like a 50% more damage multiplier. That's obviously huge. That's better than 7 Link even. But it doesn't really have much else. It doesn't have any evasion. It only has energy shield, which we don't scale. So you will lose out on some things. You can go for a defensive chest if you want to. Maybe a lightning coil, maybe a cloak of flame. But basically, Covenant gets better the shittier your bow is. If your bow is absolutely dog... So for example, this is the bow I currently have. Now it gives you 52% more damage. But if you put this bow in, all of a sudden you'll see... Covenant matters a lot less. It's only 39% more damage. And that's because it gives you the same thing as the bow. So if the bow has less, relatively it's more important. So that's kind of this weird predicament where a expensive chest is better early than later, right? So that's kind of weird. What's really the best way for this to do? I'm not really sure. It depends on the economy. I can't really tell you anything to buy, and then it's like 20 divines. So we'll have to see. I'll definitely mention it in the update videos. But if you get a Covenant for free, I mean, just take it. It's going to be so much damage, especially early. But yeah, that's about it. I'm going to work a little bit on the leveling PoB and then put out the guide about that as well in a few hours from whenever you see this. Might be already out, and link down below. In general, hope you guys have a good league start. Maybe you can do this. This is kind of like the way to play a Transfigure gem, but it's not necessary, but you can still play around with the new mechanics. I'm super hyped about this build. I still remember how it felt in 3.19, which was Calandra League, funnily enough, but it was still fun just because I was able to play this build. If you guys want to play along, I'll be live streaming League Start over on twitch.tv/Palsteron. You can just hang out, chill, a little bit of fun, drink some coffee. Yeah, otherwise, hope you have a good League Start. See you guys around. And with that being said, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.